Chapter 4. Steel had wound up the 2 clocks from the kitchen. Rob and Helen had watched him as Sapphire performed her customary task of sensing and testing the atmosphere of the room. Now, Steel was winding a small clock with a cartoon face that had stood on the narrow bookshelf in the attic bedroom. The noise of the wind outside sounded thin and solitary as usual up here at the top of the house. But, to Rob, the ticking of the 3 clocks inside seemed to compensate. He felt like telling Steel that it sounded like old times to hear them working again. But Steel did not seem to be the kind of person who would appreciate a joke, so Rob said nothing, as Steel began placing the 3 clocks at carefully strategic positions within the room. "So, what happened to the clocks?" Rob asked. Steel was arranging the larger of the 2 kitchen clocks so that he could see its face from any angle in the room. "They wound themselves down," was his only answer. Rob stared at the nearest clock. "But my father winds those every day." "I expect he does," said Steel, standing back to survey his arrangement. "So, how can clocks wind themselves down in just a fraction of a second?" There was no answer from Steel, so Rob turned to look at Sapphire. "It isn't possible," he said to her. "I know." She gave him just a trace of the smile. "And yet it's happened." Rob turned to look at the clocks again, but found that Steel was looking at him. "You say that you were in this room with your parents and your sister before going downstairs." "That's right," Rob answered. "And that's the last you saw of your parents?" "Yes." "So where was the child?" Rob indicated. "Sitting up in bed." Steel nodded to Sapphire, who led Helen to the bed, lifted her, and sat her upon it. Steel looked at Rob. "Like that?" "More or less, yes," said Rob. He then saw that Helen was looking at him. She seemed troubled and unsure of things. "Just stay there, Helen," he said to her gently. "Just do as they say and stay there. Everything's all right." "Yes, Rob," whispered Helen, managing a small, nervous smile. Steel continued to organise Rob and the room. "And your father was where?" Rob pointed towards the small dressing table. "He always sat on the edge of there." "Sit there, will you?" ordered Steel. Rob stared at the man. "What?" "I said sit there. Just sit as he was sitting when you last saw him." Rob thought about it for a couple of seconds. He then walked to the dressing table and sat down on the very edge of it. He looked down at his father's pouch and pipe that were now beside him. He reached down for them. "And please don't touch anything." As Rob withdrew his hand, he wondered why Steel ever bothered to use the word please. "And your mother was sitting in this chair?" Steel was pointing at the rocking chair. "Yes." Steel nodded yet again to Sapphire. She walked to the rocking chair and sat in it. Steel then reached down for the book of traditional nursery rhymes. He showed the book to Rob. "And this was the book that your mother was reading from?" "Yes." "Aloud?" "Yes." As Steel handed the book to Sapphire, Rob remembered how his mother would read from the book, with his father sitting, watching, and he realised fully at that moment just how much he missed them and the warm, safe comfort that they always seemed to provide. He also realised that he had taken that comfort too much for granted. He never once wanted to stay around while nursery rhymes were being read. He had felt that he was just slightly above all that. Now he wished that he had stayed. Just once. Just on that last occasion. Perhaps he could have helped, could have done something when this time thing, whatever it was, came into the room. Steele's voice interrupted his thoughts. Which particular rhyme? Then, before Rob could adjust from those thoughts, which particular rhyme was being read aloud when the clock stopped when you heard the noise? "I wasn't here, was I? I was downstairs," said Rob. Questions coming from Steele were like part of an interrogation. It is important to know the exact rhyme. "Well, I'm sorry, but I don't know it," Rob protested. As always, Sapphire spoke at just the right moment, easing the tension. "Helen," she said to the child, "do you remember which nursery rhyme it was?" Helen said nothing. "She's not very talkative at first," Rob said, glad to break off the exchange with Steele. "Not very talkative with strangers." Sapphire gave Rob the cool, bright smile which immediately made him want to assist her at any price. "Then you try," she suggested. Rob looked across the room to his sister. "Helen," he called. She looked at him. "When Mama—" Rob decided to choose his words carefully. "Just before Mama went away. Do you remember?" Helen gave only the slightest of nods. "What was she reading to you? Which nursery rhyme?" "Don't know," said Helen quietly. "You do know, Helen. You must know." Helen shook her head, but Rob persevered, trying to be as gentle and as persuasive as possible. "So which one? Tell us, Helen, please." Helen sat there on the bed for a long moment. She moved her eyes, but not her head, to look first at Sapphire, then at Steele, then back to Rob. "Best one," Helen whispered. "Your favourite?" Rob felt pleased with his progress. "Ring-a-ring-a-roses?" Helen nodded once more and gave a slight, almost shy smile. Sapphire was already turning the pages of the book. "Ring-a-ring-a-roses is derived from the times of the plague," she told Steele. "Could be one more factor, even the final one." She found the page in the book. Steele had moved to the centre of the room. He looked at the 3 clocks in turn, then proceeded to study the walls and ceiling of the attic room. Rob and Helen watched him. "Read the rhymes slowly," Steele instructed, as he kept a watch on the room. "Stop whenever I raise my hand. When I lower my hand, continue." "Right," said Sapphire, the open book ready on her lap. "But if I shout to you to stop, then stop immediately." Steele was still watching the walls and ceiling. "If I say back, back, reverse the order of the words." "I know." Sapphire nodded, and Rob noticed that her face was very serious now. The almost lazy coolness had gone. In its place was an expression of deep concentration. "But carefully," Steele warned her, looking equally serious. "Not one mistake, not even one letter said wrongly." Sapphire nodded and waited, the book now raised in her hands. Rob was watching. Helen watched also, the teddy bear doll still held close to her. The varied but steady ticking of the 3 clocks. "Begin now," said Steele as he watched the room. Sapphire began to read slowly from the book, pausing for long moments between each set of words. "Ring-a-ring-a-roses, a pocket full of posies." Helen smiled as she heard the words of her favourite rhyme. Then Steele raised his hand, just slightly, and Sapphire stopped reading. Steele looked carefully at the walls and the ceiling from his position in the centre of the room. He then lowered his hand. A tissue, read Sapphire from the book. "We all fall down." She waited a moment, but there was no further signal from Steele. "The king has sent his daughter," then something. A very faint rustling sound somewhere in the room. Steele raised his hand quickly, and Sapphire immediately stopped reading. Steel looked around at the room. Nothing could be seen, although the faint rustling sound continued. Then the larger of the kitchen clocks stopped. Steel glanced quickly at the clock. Then, watching the room once more, and with the steady concentration of a man defusing a time bomb, he lowered his hand. "To fetch a pail of water," read Sapphire from the book. The sound increased. It was like a shaking, a pattering, a fluttering. "A tissue, read Sapphire. The sound deepened now in intensity and became more of a vibrant rumbling, more like the sound that Rob had heard earlier that evening. "We all fall down." Rob could imagine giant sails in a wind. There was even a slight current of air in the room now, like a light breeze that picked at Steele's hair, and Rob could almost visualize the fabric as it shook and strained under pressure. He imagined a fabric like a skin, a living fabric, and he began to feel frightened. Even Sapphire had glanced up from the book, but Steele's hand remained lowered as he focused his attention on the room, looking for the very source of the sound. The cartoon hands on the face of the bedroom clock stopped. Only the one small clock remained working. "The bird upon the steeple," read Sapphire. It appeared as the third and last clock stopped ticking. Steel saw it first, then Rob. Sapphire was also aware of its presence. It was a moving, flickering shape that appeared high up near the apex of the end wall. It seemed at first to be a part of the wall texture itself, as if the plaster of the wall was shifting. Then it appeared to take on a series of quick, broken images. Rob felt that it looked like pieces of old and faded moving film, except that these images were three-dimensional. Rob also thought that he heard, under the rumbling of the skin-like fabric, the sound of voices that seemed to squeal with laughter or pain, or both. Steel raised his hand and Sapphire stopped reading at once. The movement on the patch of wall and the half-seen pictures seemed to freeze. The sound stayed at a constant level. Steel took a few cautious steps towards the end of the room and halted. He looked up at the patch of wall. Rob turned anxiously towards Sapphire, but Sapphire had anticipated his concern. She looked at him and put her finger to her lips. Steel began to lower his hand very slowly, and Sapphire spoke the next line of the rhyme simultaneously. "Sits high," the shapes on the wall began to move. The sound began to increase. "Above," continued Sapphire, her eyes moving from the book to Steel to the wall to the book again, and Rob and Helen stared wide-eyed at the section of wall as the voice sounds and the fabric sound seemed to overlap and the shifting pictures and shapes jostled and mingled into one another. "The people..." Then, as Sapphire raised her voice so that the last two words of the rhyme could be heard, the patch of wall began to move outwards, as if something behind it was pushing at it, as if the wall itself was melting. Steel shouted loudly, "Stop!" Sapphire stopped reading. "Back! Back!" shouted Steel. "Take it back!" "People the above," read Sapphire slowly. "High sits." Rob stared as the wall appeared to check its melting effect. "Steeple the upon bird the." As Sapphire continued to read the words backwards, the pictures upon the wall began to fade. So, too, did the sounds. By the time Sapphire had read the words, "Down fall all we," the patch of wall had returned to normal, and the sounds had completely died away. "Down fall all we," said Steel in the now quiet room, and it was like a question put to the room itself. And Rob watched Steel as the man breathed out deeply and slackened his body, like someone who had just performed a strenuous mental task. It was Helen who broke the moment of relaxed stillness. "Pictures," she said, pointing a small finger at the far wall. "Saw pictures." "Yes, Helen, but it's all right now," said Rob, and he moved across the room to the bed and sat down next to his sister. Sapphire had closed the book. She was looking at Steel as if waiting for his next move. The fabric you were talking about, Rob began, trying to catch Sapphire's eye. Was it... But Sapphire was still looking at Steel, as if there were more important questions than Rob's to be asked at that particular moment. We can't seal it yet, then, she asked Steel. Steel looked up at last. No, he said. Not until we've brought those people back. And his moment of relaxation was over. Once more he was businesslike and coldly efficient. I want that book taken downstairs and destroyed. Sapphire nodded as she rose from the chair, the book tucked firmly under one arm. Has the child somewhere else to sleep? Steel was switching off the bedside lamp. Yes, said Rob. There's a spare bed in the room next to mine. Where? Next floor down. Then take her there. Steel picked up the 2 kitchen clocks, moved to the door and held it open, ushering the others out from the room that was now dark and empty-looking. And is there a key to this door? Asked Steel as they moved out onto the landing. Rob shook his head. No, it was lost years ago. Steel pulled the door to, slamming it tightly shut. Then I want no one to enter this room. Is that understood? Yes, said Rob. Not until we've done what we have to do. Rob nodded automatically, wondering what it was that had to be done, but Steel was already descending the stairs. Sapphire, holding Helen's hand, followed him down. Rob was still looking at the closed door of the room as Steel switched off the top landing light from below. Rob turned quickly and hurried down the stairs after the others.